They called it the Flying Fortress, and German pilots laughed. From their cockpits high above Europe, Luftwaffe aces stared at the photos, the reports, the propaganda posters of that bulky four-engine American bomber and smirked. To them, it was nothing but an oversized target, slow, clumsy, and easy meat for the sharp fangs of the Bf-109s and FW-190s that ruled Europe's skies. "Flying fortress?" one German pilot scoffed. "More like a flying barn." It was arrogance, the same confidence that had carried the Luftwaffe from Warsaw to Paris to the English Channel. To them, no bomber formation could cross German skies and live. Not when their fighters waited like hawks above the clouds. But far away across the Atlantic, in the assembly lines of Seattle, something different was taking shape, something the Germans had never truly faced. The Boeing B-17 wasn't built to outrun or outmaneuver. It was built to endure. With armor that could stop 20mm shells and 13.50 caliber machine guns jutting from every direction, it looked less like an airplane and more like a fortress of aluminum and firepower. To the men who would fly inside it, barely out of their teens, many on their first missions over enemy territory, it was both their lifeline and their coffin. They knew the odds. By late 1942, few B-17 crews lasted 25 missions. Yet still, they climbed into those bombers, strapped themselves in, and faced the endless gray ocean and black flak clouds that waited for them. And on one freezing morning, as dozens of these flying fortresses roared toward the heart of occupied Europe, the laughter of German pilots would soon turn into disbelief and fear. Because what they were about to face was not a formation of bombers. It was a wall of lead. And once the sky lit up with tracer fire, they would learn, in the most brutal way possible, why the Americans had named it the Flying Fortress. When the B-17 Flying Fortresses first entered European airspace, the German Luftwaffe barely took them seriously. The Americans were newcomers to the war in the air, untested, unseasoned, and seemingly unaware of the sheer intensity that awaited them over the continent. The German High Command expected the bombers to crumble under pressure, to scatter once the flak and fighters hit. But by late 1942, reality was beginning to shift, and the first deep penetration raids over France and Germany would prove that the U.S. Army Air Forces were not to be underestimated. The early missions were brutal. Fortresses from the 8th Air Force lifted off from bases across England, places like Bassingbourn, Kimballton, and Thorpe Abbotts, and headed toward occupied Europe in tight formations, their silver wings glinting in the weak morning sun. Inside, young airmen checked their oxygen masks, adjusted their guns, and listened to the distant thump of flak exploding thousands of feet below. As they crossed the French coast, the air around them turned hostile. German radar had already picked them up, and within minutes, the first Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s began climbing to intercept. They came in fast, diving from the sun or climbing from beneath the formations. Classic Luftwaffe tactics. The American gunners braced themselves. The sky erupted. The sound of 50 caliber machine guns tore through the thin air, deafening, relentless, mechanical. The bombers flew in tight combat boxes, overlapping their fields of fire, so that every approach meant flying into a storm of lead. Dozens of German fighters were hit before they could even reach firing range. Still, they came, wave after wave. And yet, the fortresses didn't scatter. They didn't break formation. Even when engines caught fire and wings were shredded by cannon shells, the formation held steady. Each bomber depended on the others for survival. Each gunner fought not just for his crew, but for the planes around him. By the time the first B-17s reached their targets, railway yards, factories, oil depots, the Germans were stunned. Despite the losses, the bombers pressed on, dropped their payloads with surgical precision, and then turned for home, still firing back at the interceptors that hounded them all the way to the Channel. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots began to realize that this was not a single bomber. This was a fortress fleet, a flying wall of defiance. The Americans had built a machine that didn't just deliver bombs, it absorbed punishment and fought back. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force had made its presence impossible to ignore. Factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg lay in ruins. The German war machine, once untouchable behind its defensive wall, was beginning to feel the pressure. But victory in the air came at a terrible cost. Entire crews vanished over the North Sea. Some bombers returned with half their tail sections missing. Others limped back on 2 engines, their gunners frozen and their pilots dead. Each successful raid was paid for in lives. Still, the flying fortress kept coming. And to the Germans watching from the ground, the distant drone of those engines became a sound of dread, the sound of a sky that could no longer be controlled. By 1943, the skies above Europe had become the deadliest battlefield on Earth. The U.S. 8th Air Force, flying its mighty B-17 flying fortresses, was determined to cripple the heart of the Nazi war machine. The factories, oil refineries, and industrial hubs that kept Hitler's armies alive. But the Luftwaffe would not yield easily. Every mission that crossed into German airspace became a brutal test of endurance. Entire cities turned into killing zones. Hamburg, Bremen, Stuttgart, Schweinfurt. German flak batteries filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel, exploding with such precision that bomber crews joked grimly they could walk on the flak. Then came the fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, and twin-engine heavy fighters armed with 20mm cannons and air-to-air rockets. They swarmed the bomber streams like sharks scenting blood. It was here that the flying fortress showed its true nature. When the Germans struck, the B-17 formations closed ranks, locking into defensive combat boxes, staggered layers of bombers arranged to maximize their fields of fire. Each fortress protected the other, turning the sky into a cage of overlapping machine gun fire. Approaching one meant flying into 1,000 spinning tracers. Crews fought like trapped wolves. Tail gunners tracked the incoming fighters through their crosshairs, squeezing the triggers until the barrels glowed red-hot. Waist gunners fired from open windows, their oxygen masks frosting over from the sub-zero air rushing past. Pilots fought to keep formation even as their engines burned, knowing that to fall out meant certain death. On October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt, the infamous Black Thursday, became a turning point. Hundreds of flying fortresses went in without adequate fighter escort, striking deep into southern Germany to destroy the ball-bearing factories critical to the German war industry. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at them. For hours, the formations were hammered by flak and swarmed by fighters. 60 bombers went down. Over 600 airmen were lost in a single day. And yet, the survivors did not retreat in panic. They pressed on, dropped their bombs, and limped back across the Channel. Crippled planes landed on English runways riddled with holes, some missing engines, some missing entire tails. But they had delivered their payloads. The cost was staggering, but the message was clear. The Allies would not stop. German pilots began to see the fortresses differently. they realized these bombers didn't behave like anything else in the sky. They didn't turn back when half their crew was dead. They didn't fall apart after taking a dozen hits. Some made it home with wings shredded, engines gone, fuel leaking, sheer stubbornness and engineering keeping them aloft. By the winter of 1943 to 44, even hardened Luftwaffe aces started admitting the truth. The Flying Fortress wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol. A symbol of industrial might, precision, and sheer defiance. Every time the droning roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines echoed over the horizon, every time those formations appeared above the clouds, German morale slipped a little further. The Reich's factories could rebuild, its defenses could recover. But the sound of the fortress never stopped coming. And soon, it would come with escorts, sleek, silver fighters that could go the distance. When the P-51 Mustang joined the battle, the tide of air war would change forever. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. For months, the B-17 Flying Fortresses had battered their way deep into the Reich, suffering unbearable losses to prove one thing: that daylight precision bombing could bring Germany's war machine to its knees. But despite the courage of the bomber crews, the reality was grim. Too many planes weren't coming home. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. The arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang transformed the air war from a desperate struggle into a relentless offensive. For the first time, the Flying Fortresses weren't alone. The Mustang's revolutionary drop tanks gave it the range to escort bombers from English bases all the way to Berlin and back, a distance no Allied fighter had ever covered. Now, as the massive B-17 formations rumbled toward the heart of Germany, silver shapes appeared high above them, sleek, fast, and deadly. The Mustangs flew cover at 25,000 feet, weaving through contrails, diving on any German fighters that dared approach. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies uncontested, suddenly found itself outnumbered and outflown. The effects were immediate and devastating. German pilots who had once mocked the Flying Fortress now found themselves hunted before they could even reach it. Messerschmitts were cut down mid-climb, Focke-Wulfs torn apart before lining up a single shot. Those who made it to the bombers met the same blinding wall of 50 caliber gunfire that had shredded so many before them. The fortress formations became nearly unstoppable. Mission after mission, they hit oil refineries, railway hubs, and weapons plants across Germany. The once proud Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the sky, its aces dying faster than replacements could be trained. By spring 1944, Allied bombers were striking Berlin itself. The unthinkable had happened. The capital of the Third Reich, once the symbol of invulnerability, was now under daily assault. German citizens watched helplessly as the skies filled with hundreds of flying fortresses, their bomb bays opening in perfect synchronization. Columns of black smoke rose into the clouds, and the myth of German invincibility crumbled. For the airmen inside those bombers, victory came at a cost that could never be measured in medals. Each mission felt like a lifetime. Hours of freezing air, exploding shells, and the constant scream of engines pushed to their limits. Many didn't return. Those who did landed with empty seats beside them, faces frozen in exhaustion, their eyes reflecting everything they'd seen and everything they'd lost. But the tide had turned. With the skies now under Allied control, Germany's factories began to falter. Fuel grew scarce, ammunition ran low, and the Wehrmacht's mobility, its greatest strength, began to collapse. And for the German pilots still flying, the laughter was long gone. What they once dismissed as a lumbering giant had become a relentless storm that darkened the sky, day after day, without pause or mercy. The Flying Fortress had lived up to its name. It wasn't just a bomber. It was a floating fortress of defiance, a machine that turned courage into steel and fire. By the final year of the war, the B-17 Flying Fortress had become more than just a machine of destruction. It was a legend forged in fire, smoke, and sacrifice. Across England, airfields that once buzzed with daily takeoffs now stood quieter, filled with rows of weary, battle-scarred bombers. Each one bore the scars of the war, flak holes patched with metal sheets, names painted in fading white letters, and tally marks showing missions survived. The men who flew them were no longer the wide-eyed recruits who had first arrived from the States. They were veterans now, hardened by the endless roar of engines, the sight of burning aircraft falling through the clouds, and the heavy knowledge that every mission might be their last. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 airmen, a casualty rate higher than that of the U.S. Marine Corps in the entire Pacific. Every bomber that landed represented a story of endurance, loss, and brotherhood that no statistics could ever capture. The Flying Fortress had changed the course of the war. Strategic bombing, once dismissed as a fantasy, had proven its worth. German production was crippled, oil supplies shattered, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was now a shadow of its former self. By D-Day, the Allies held near total air superiority, a victory built on the backs of those massive, thunderous bombers, and the young men who refused to break under fire. Even the enemy came to respect them. Captured German pilots later admitted that the B-17 was one of the toughest aircraft they had ever faced. A plane that shouldn't have been able to fly with half its damage, yet somehow always made it home to them. The sound of those 4 Wright Cyclone engines became the sound of inevitability, the sound of a war they could no longer win. When the war ended in 1945, many of the surviving B-17s were scrapped, melted down, or abandoned in fields. But for those who had flown in them, the memory never faded. Veterans would later describe the aircraft as a living thing, a fortress that breathed, groaned, and fought beside them through every mile of hell. And their legacy lived on. The courage of the fortress crews redefined modern air warfare. They proved that technology alone could not win a war. It took discipline, teamwork, and an unbreakable will to survive. Every future bomber, from the B-29 to the B-52, carried the DNA of the B-17, its toughness, its precision, and its spirit of defiance. Today, when the last few flying fortresses take to the sky at air shows, their deep, rhythmic engines echo across the airfields, the same sound that once shook the heart of Germany. People stop and look up, hearing not just the roar of engines, but the ghostly echo of history, the bravery of tens of thousands who never returned. The German pilots, who once laughed at the Flying Fortress, learned too late what it truly was. Not a clumsy bomber, but a symbol of resilience, unity, and the relentless will of free men to fight back against tyranny. Because in the end, it wasn't just a plane that conquered the skies of Europe. It was the spirit inside it. If you were moved by this story, by the men who faced impossible odds and never turned back, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends. Here, we keep their courage alive. One story, one mission, one legend at a time.